Can You Imagine by Mary Oliver. For example, what the trees do, not only in lightning storms or the watery dark of a summer's night or under the white nets of winter, but now, and now, and now, whenever we're not looking. Surely you can't imagine they don't dance, from the root up, wishing to travel a little, not cramped so much as wanting a better view or more sun, or just as avidly more shade. Surely you can't imagine they just stand there loving every minute of it. The birds or the emptiness, the dark rings of the years slowly and without a sound, thickening. And nothing different unless the wind, and then only in its own mood, comes to visit. Surely you can't imagine patience and happiness like that.
Alex Leigh Lemoine is a writer, poet, mixed media artist, Reiki master, and certified holistic life coach living in Louisiana. Alex cultivates her passion for healing, personal growth, and authenticity through her work. She talks about heartbreak, depression, anxiety, self-worth, and love, sex, being queer, nature, and more. Writing and reading came into her life by way of self-reflection and therapy. The intention behind Alex's work is to promote healing and self-love through literature and connecting with ourselves without the narrative of shame. Alex created Clarity Excursions Collective, seasonal wellness camping retreats designed to detox from the digital world and promote a safe space of sobriety. On these trips, Alex facilitates breathwork, guided meditations, and visualizations, as well as art therapy. Combining her love for writing and self-reflection, Alex offers not only an adventure into the wilderness, but an adventure into ourselves, pairing the idea that we are one with all living beings. She also participates in local art markets, writing custom poetry for customers on the spot using her 1950s Royal typewriter, as well as creating custom poetry, books for wedding couples, love stories, etc. Alex works to create community through poetry and tapas backyard events, where she hosts a local chef and other local poets and lyricists. These magical backyard moments cultivate a sense of importance for our local artists and aim to inspire community gathering and art appreciation. She is discovering her voice as a writer, healer, and working on a few projects that will be released in the near future, including a collection of poetry, storytelling, and prose. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yes, thank you. Happy to have you. Rise Words. I think this is as good a moment as any to discuss Rise Words, and any poets that you love to read. We heard that poem at the top from Mary Oliver. So can you just talk about that movement, that name, Rise Words, maybe how that came into your life?
Yeah, it was kind of a play on words where I really wanted to create an outlet for my writing that was more than just my name. And one day it just popped into my mind that what I'm kind of reaching for is this inner wisdom. And so I started thinking, what are wise words? And there was also this imagery in my mind, this idea of, instead of falling in love with myself, I feel more like I'm rising in love with myself and my life and art and poetry. And then it just hit me, Rise Words. And that was how I got the name of that. And I decided that this could be something because it's not just my name and just me showcasing myself as a poet, that this can also be a platform to showcase other poets and artists that inspire me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for that. And then, it's so cool to hear you talk about the wordplay in it. And this was probably intentional too, but the first time I said it out loud, I was like, oh, it's like, forwards, onwards, backwards, rise words.
I love that.
and so like when you said the play on words, I was like, oh, okay, so it is that. And then you mentioned other ones, and I was like, oh, wow, that really is. There's really a lot going on.
Yeah, it kind of just worked out for me. Sometimes those things happen and you just got to go with it.
You just got to pull that thread. And I love that, rather than falling in love with ourselves, which is already such a beautiful thing, and I think a precious thing. But then to think about it like rising in love with yourself and sort of rising toward yourself, right? And the notion of there being like a supreme self that, we already are, but we're also moving towards.
Yes, like the highest version of ourselves, you could say. And, Ram Dass has a beautiful quote about we're all just walking each other home. And so I kind of see it in a similar thing where we are that highest version of ourselves. And somewhere along the way, we pick up things that are not necessarily ours, and it becomes quite heavy, and we're learning to deconstruct that as we move through our lives. And it's almost like a piling on top of us that we're removing, and the imagery of rising still kind of comes from that.
Yeah, and creating it plays such an important role in that, right? And seeing the self create and seeing the sort of objects that come from that process and that progress, and like creation, like just the artistic experience, I think like the improvement of the self it can be very solitary work, but it's also very collaborative too. It's so built on relationships. Relationships that go right, relationships that go wrong, relationships that end, relationships that last a long time. Like holding each other's hand can look so differently depending on that interaction.
Absolutely. Right? And people are such mirrors for us. It would be very difficult to see ourselves without that mirror.
Yeah, totally. I agree. And then thinking about poets too, I'm currently working on, and even though this is coming out in late July, I can still say that because I'll be working on this poem for a while, but there's a poet who I admire that I talked to you about already, David Cherami, the current poet laureate of Louisiana, and I'm writing a poem right now based on his work, and so I've been revisiting a lot of his older poetry and just like reading it and then just sort of letting the inspiration happen. And though David is not holding my hand or sitting in front of me, there is still this interaction that we're having, and through his work being the medium. And I think when we read other poets, or when we hear someone else reading a poem, or when we talk even about poetry, it can be such a good medium that sort of acts like that mirror that you mentioned.
Absolutely. For sure. And I think it's also, it's very inspiring. Like it tugs and resonates with certain parts of us that could also help us to be creative.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so just to kind of dive a little deeper, I was so interested in the idea of custom poetry and, poetry on the spot. And of course, I've seen people doing this in public, and, been following you on your Instagram and see you doing that on your Royal typewriter. And I think that's just super cool and creative and fun, and it's like such a neat experience for anyone listening who has never done this for whatever reason. But if you see someone in the street, be it Alex or someone else, providing custom poetry, definitely go for it. it's a really fun experience to have someone write a poetry for you and write a poem for you. So Alex, can you just kind of break down like what goes into that, how you prepare, what kind of questions you ask, just how that works?
Absolutely. So, my preparation has evolved over the years. But really what I do is I always bring my typewriter, any ribbon that I need in case, typewriter. It's so interesting when you're working with an old tool. It's kind of a risk, you never know what could happen to the mechanics of it. And thankfully I've had quite a few problems, so I've had to learn. So I feel very confident in, my, repair skills. So,
okay, that's cool.
So, and then I just bring a very small table, small enough for me to fit the typewriter, my paper, a pen, and some sort of signage. And then I have a chair, and I always have a chair in front of me. And then I'll create like a wooden sign that says, poetry is therapy, or custom poems, something that kind of gives the person walking on the street the idea of what's going on. And but it doesn't fully give it away. So it kind of entices people to come closer and to ask more questions about it. And it's really a fascinating energy, because a lot of the times when you are just a vendor at a market and you're selling a product, it can be a very fast exchange, or it can be a lengthier exchange. And it's something we're used to. We go to stores, we see a product, we either like it or we don't, and we either purchase it or we don't. And with the custom poetry, it's almost like an aliveness that has to happen. It turns off that like robotic sense of shopping that we can have. It creates an energy of vulnerability and a curiosity, really. So when people come closer and they ask questions, they're always like, what are you doing here? And I always say, I'm doing custom poetry on the spot. And you can give me a word, you can give me a topic, a thought. It could be a sentence, and I'll write something for you. And I offer, smaller poems or larger poems. And it's more of like a prose that I'm writing. I'm writing kind of a story. I'm very wordy. So I like to have the space to offer more words. And most of the time people are nervous. They feel like they're put on the spot, which I think is so fascinating, because you would think the opposite. Here I am having to like come up with a whole poem, but it really makes people think, in that moment. I think there's a sense of, I don't want to just give you the first thing that comes to my mind. I really want some clarity on this moment or this struggle or this difficulty in my life. It almost becomes like therapy, which I personally love. And, sometimes people need help. Sometimes they have it. They have their word. And it's an energy exchange. A lot of the times people will just give me one word, and I can go off of that word and the energy that I feel with them. And then other times I need to ask further questions. And it's, this was born from recognizing the energy of writing with the typewriter. It's very, very different from journal, just handwriting, or typing on a laptop or a computer. There's a sense of, there's a fire, there's a passion, there's an emotion there that I can only get with the typewriter. And so it's a channeling of sorts, and it's a being of service. Of course, the poems I'm writing have everything to do with my own inner reflections and thoughts, but it's in service to what I am intuitively tapping into that this person in front of me needs to hear. And if I question myself, then I might as well pick up my stuff and go, because I would be sitting there for hours. I can't really question the flow. It forces me into a flow, into the present moment, and really to be in my body and out of my mind, which is so interesting when you're thinking about words.
Yeah, I love that last part too, about it being like almost like a bodily experience and a bodily act. It's like something that your body's doing. I mean, typewriters are loud, and like when you have to hit the keys hard and with confidence. Like you cannot hesitate on that H. You really got to like smash that H, and it's it does become like a physical act, and that's something we do get a version of with handwriting, but a much more intimate and quiet and kind of whispery writing experience. Whereas typing on a typewriter, like you said, you cannot hesitate. You cannot question yourself. I like just the image of like, if I'm questioning myself, I gotta pack up and go home, because I mean you're there. Like you're fully there, and I think just doing that, it kind of helps maybe the person on the receiving end of the poem to be more vulnerable and to also be there. And it's true that, gosh, I mean, the another thing that you said too that I really enjoy is the idea of this being like therapy or therapeutic. I think in this case of, if someone is bringing a difficult experience or a fragment of their own trauma or pain to you, first of all, the vulnerability that it takes to do that, but also the medicine like that a poem can provide, especially in the way that you write and sort of turning it into story and like prose and wordiness, I think can be so powerful, because narrative, it can be so medicinal. And seeing, if someone is going through chronic pain and they're telling their physician about it, the physician's ability to relay that, whether back to them or in like a journal on medicine, or at a conference or something, like if the physician has an ability to really create a narrative with that person's experience, there's plenty of studies that show the power in that and the ability to contribute to healing and well-being. So I think there's definitely a similar kind of thing at play here, where no matter what the experience is, be it difficult or even full of pleasure, there's so much power in like creating narrative out of someone's experience.
Absolutely. It becomes, an experience for them so much more than just this product. And it's a connection, it's someone else might be going through something very different than me, or might live a very different life than me. But I think what that experience does, and I think poetry does this, is it creates this, or it ties together this idea that we are one. And there's this interconnectivity. Mm-hmm. There's this universal or collective pain, trauma, joy, life that we all experience, regardless of our differences in identity and circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think so that there's another point too that I wanted to just discuss with you, to kind of zoom out a little bit toward poetry therapy, and then like the Poetry and Tapas event that you host. And can you just discuss that, like poetic therapy in general? What does that mean to you? And maybe it's just the potential that poetry has in the healing process. So not only in these custom poetry situations, but just in general in life as a poet.
Yeah, absolutely. So poetic therapy was my third Backyard and Tapas event. And I worked with 3 different chefs for each one. And the first 2 were more catered to themes that the chefs wanted. And I was writing poetry based on their theme. And I'm just going to touch on those very briefly, and I'll get back to poetic therapy. But the first one we did was called Lagom. And I did this with a friend who was from Sweden. And lagom is a word that doesn't translate into English. And it kind of means balance, not too much, but not too little. And so I was able to take that word and create poetry around that, and also celebrate midsummer and the Swedish culture. And so I think that was healing for the community to just expand. For people who don't travel often or don't see other cultures, it's nice for them to have a moment to experience a life different than their own. And something similar with the second event, which was called Waterlogged. So that one was all about leaving the South, but then always finding yourself back in the South. And so therefore you're waterlogged. And so those were very specific themes that I think just got people thinking about one thing. But as far as poetic therapy was concerned, that was what I had always wanted to implement for myself, because the idea was really born from the custom poetry sessions and recognizing that it was so much more than just me writing poetry. It really became therapy. I mean, a number of people leave crying. I still to this day forget to bring Kleenex with me whenever I do these things, but I need to remember to do that. And so I wanted to expand on that idea. And instead of just me being the poet, I wanted to pull other lyricists, rap artists, and poets into that and be inspired by them and what their idea of using words and poetry for therapy could look like. So I had my chef come in and we created this idea where we were going to do 4 courses and we were going to have 4 poets. And so once each course was served, then a poet would perform. So it really was dinner and a show. And all of these events are done in a beautiful, intimate backyard space with a lot of greenery, plants, art hanging up, and lighting, and just making it very intimate. There's never more than 25 people at these events, 25 to 30 people. And so the poets I pulled in were very diverse. I had Myron Saul, who raps under the name Lucid Dreams. He lives in New Orleans. And he spoke a lot about growing up and his love for music and kind of chasing the dream, but the world fighting back at you. And he talked about really keeping that fire alive and still doing what you loved, even when you were at that thing you loved at 11 years old. And then I had Alex, Poetic Soul. She is local to Lafayette, and she is a part of a poetic group called Lyrically Inclined, and they do a lot of competitions and poetry performances, and she works with the incarcerated youth, using poetry and words to help them express their emotions through that outlet. So she kind of teaches what she lives. You know, she uses poetry as a form of expressing her pain and her trauma, much of it that she went through. And it's very bold and abrasive and performative. Her poetry, the words are extremely potent, but the energy, the potency, I don't think I've ever experienced a more piercing poet than her. And then I had Michelle White, who performs under the name Aphrodite Sings, and she is a more theatrical poet. And she talks a lot about the fluidity of gender and sexual identity and heartbreak and loving a lot of people and the shame around that, the shame around all of those themes, really. And she does a lot of clothing changing throughout her performances and embodiment. I would say that she embodies a part of her pain in a performance that is so moving. She's also a therapist. And so she was able to give this perspective of what it means to be a therapist And she talked a lot about that in her poetry. And really, she says it so simply, and I love this, is that it's just giving someone the space to love them while they're pouring out some of their most shameful thoughts to you. And I really resonate with all of these poets, and everything they said was kind of touching on parts of my soul, which was really profound. And I talk a lot about that in my poetry, and as you mentioned in my bio, being able to look at words and use our words in literature and art as a way to understand ourselves better without the narrative of shame. I think shame is one of the lowest energy feelings that we can feel, and it's distorting. It distorts our reality of who we are. It's not so much I did a bad thing as it is I am bad. And that can be very destructive and very painful. And so that's what the whole idea of poetic therapy was for me, was to I want to bring people together in this small community of Lafayette and offer them something that you can't typically get on just a Friday or Saturday night, something that's really eclectic and different. And also I want to showcase the local talent, to really show you that in someone's backyard, you can be experiencing some incredibly gifted people who are just living out their passions and thinking probably very similarly to some of you, and creating the connection through poetry. It was fascinating to watch, the crowd sit and listen. You're not really having conversations with these poets, but you are at the same time. There's so much connection that's going on in that moment. So that's what poetic therapy was for me. And even a continuation of just using those words to always remember that poetry is therapy. And it, there's a hashtag, and there's a poetry still matters hashtag. And I was kind of playing on that because I wanted to shine light on the importance of how we use our words, whether we're speaking to ourselves or other people. They are quite literally spells. And I think that we move so fast as a society, and we move so quickly within our own lives, in our own minds, that sometimes we may not even recognize all the things that we're speaking into existence.
Yes, thank you so much. That's fascinating, and there's such just a big plurality of beauty in the things that you just said, and I like the spotlight that you gave to those poets, and I love just the diversity of experiences that are brought into that space, because, as you said, though there may not have been a sort of typical conversation between the people who are listening and watching and the speakers, there is an exchange happening, and there's definitely, I guess, so much universality in that hyper-local context for anyone really to go there and with the right vulnerability and openness and sort of attention can experience a kind of revolution, or the beginning of maybe a revolution that can be such a huge inspirational moment for people that are at these events. And I think in lies the therapy, right? Where we have this simultaneous inward and outward kind of look at ourselves and at the environment.
Absolutely. I think too, it's a kind of a jumping through a lot of steps. So what I mean by that is, it breaks past the small talk. It's almost like, one of my beliefs is that I think we're all wanting that vulnerability. Maybe some of us don't practice it, and it can be jarring and it can be uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, I think most of us want to connect on that level. And Alex Johnson, Poetic Soul, opened up the night, and I mean, she started with an a cappella song and then directly went from that into the cadence of poetry. It was chilling. It was phenomenal. It was piercing. It was real. It was raw. And it just, I'm sure it was jaw dropping for people like, whoa, okay, I just took a bite of this empanada. We're already in it. Okay. but it's beautiful because I just so believe in vulnerability and in connecting through the heart. And that's really what that was about. Poetry is about. It kind of gives permission for you to go there. Whereas maybe having a typical conversation with someone and then jumping right into vulnerability can be, there can be this awkwardness. There can be this like, almost like, oh, I don't know, this kind of hesitancy. And poetry kind of breaks through all of that. And that's what I love about it.
It does. Yeah. You dive in, right? There's no prologue. There's no introduction. There's no spoon feeding. It's just like I love that intro and that example that you just gave, because to me, that's like the mark of a powerful performance, and the mark of a powerful poem too, is like the ability to just break down any sort of filters and walls right away and just jump right into the emotion or the intention, the bones of it, I guess, if you will.
Absolutely.
And now, Alex, I'd love to hear some of your poetry. I really would be delighted if you could read A World on Fire.
Absolutely. A World on Fire. People hurt us only if we let them. Privilege may be the pill I swallow here. Look at us, traveling and laughing like humans, aren't being erased by the second. Yet I still wake up and write the poetry. It's an attempt to unveil the bare skin or cry out prayers for my goodness. First thing in the morning, while some are aching with a pain so loud, I can only begin to imagine in my wildest nightmares. I pray and I pray, and I continue to write poetry for you, like the simple being, the complex being I am, sweating from the fires that I've escaped.
Thank you for that, Alex. I just this poem. So I'd like to talk about sort of the last third of it, because there's sort of like a turn that happens. I pray and I pray and I continue to write poetry for you. This part, it's like the part where you're kind of reaching out and touching the reader, and that's like the only way I can explain it, because it's very reflective up until that point, and it's very sort of observational, and exclaiming. It's like I can kind of picture you by yourself, like writing this poetry, maybe performing it, and that is happening, and then we get addressed. We, meaning everyone else in the world, write poetry for you, and the idea of like praying. And writing poetry, it's like I'm expecting like a third I pray. But it's not that, right? It's like I pray, and well, guess how long, we've been praying a long time. And so I pray and I continue to write poetry. I just love that turn, and it's very inviting and engaging, and that's like the moment where I feel the poem, I think, in its entirety, right? Like, beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think too, the words for you, there's kind of a double meaning. It's meant, yes, for the reader, but also for the people that I am writing about. And I love how you noticed, like, yeah, we've been praying a long time, and then at some point it's like, okay, we've got to take action, we've got to do something, and that's what that turn was about. And I love the last line, sweating from the fires I've escaped, because it really puts into perspective our privilege,
and also I think it kind of alludes to that action too, right? Like, pray, okay. And so now here's what I can do, as the poet, here's what I can do. And that's to operate in my lane and write poetry and scream poetry. And I'm sweating. And so, yes, in that I'm sweating from the fires I've escaped, as recognizing I've escaped, and for the reasons, of privilege or circumstance, or perhaps a womb lottery or timing or whatever you want to call it. But I am sweating, meaning like I've been, affected adjacent by the heat of this situation, or I've also acted, right? Like I've exerted some kind of energy in the midst of all this.
Correct. Yes, because we, regardless that we might be thousands and thousands of miles away from what's happening, it still affects us. And that's what that I'm sweating is about, and a reminder of what we do to one affects the whole.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and there's so much in that I, right? It's that I is like, I read I am sweating, and it's me, whenever I read that. And look at us, right? Earlier, let only our people hurt us. Look at us, and traveling and laughing like humans. I like that. There's something like very Ada Limon about that.
I love that.
It's like humans. It's like it's sort of pulling the rug out from underneath our experience a little bit.
Yes.
Like,
thank you.
I'd love to know more about just those sort of outward influences and inspirations, or maybe inward, right? Like just moments and reflections. What inspires you, say, in general too, right? Or also just if you have, super zoomed in examples, that'd be interesting too.
Yeah. I think that first and foremost, the thing that inspires me to write is my life experience. My mother is totally blind, and she was blinded at the age of 21. She was shot with a 22, and
Wow.
She survived it, and the bullet severed both optic nerves, and she lost her sense of sight and her sense of smell, and it muted her sense of taste. And this was 4 years prior to having me. And I'm her only child. So yeah, I grew up having this responsibility. And, similar to what we're speaking about of like self-awareness, I feel like when we're kids, we haven't developed that skill yet. We're just kind of these little human animals that are living. And so there was no sense of, oh, I'm different, my life is different. It was more of just adaptability. This is who I am, and this is what I have to do. And so I developed this responsibility of protection and of seeing. I've been playing with this metaphor lately that I've had to see for two people my entire life. And so it makes sense why I've always been able to see the unseen, see certain truths, see certain realities, see with my third eye. And I remember being very young in the first grade and witnessing, your typical bully situation at school. And there was just this internal dialogue that I already had where I knew that I never wanted to be in either position, but I especially never wanted to be the bully. The guilt of that was just too painful for me. I was more on that side of empathy. And I think that, that comes from how I had to grow up and the pain that I experienced and witnessed at a young age through my mother, through that generational pain. And so that my inspiration is born from carrying so many emotions. Even when I didn't have the capacity to hold all of that pain, I had to put it someplace. And because I didn't want to be the bully and I didn't want to be the hurt person hurting other people, not that I've never done that, but because I tried so hard to stray away from that, it became words, it became poetry, it became my art. And that I would say is the core of my inspiration. And then from there, I'm very inspired by certain TV shows, Insecure being one of them, Broad City, both shows that are written and acted by the same person or people. And I'm inspired by writers such as one of the main writers being Ocean Vuong. This person who is Asian American has a completely different experience and set of trauma than myself, but I can resonate so much with this person. And so I get inspired by, stepping into the shoes of another person and their pain and their experience. And then relationships are a huge inspiration for me. The mirror and watching myself navigate relationships and connecting the dots of what I saw as I grew up with my mother and my father, and my mother with her different partners, healing myself, having this almost obsession with healing myself to the point where it can teeter to a place of not accepting myself and having to kind of balance that scale of where is there room for improvement, and then where is there room to just be and to just embrace who I am. And I would say finally, being queer in the South is a huge inspiration for my writing because it's an outlet for my own pain in that, and it's also in the hopes of being a voice for others who are in so much pain, being queer and maybe still being closeted, or only having a few people that they can show their authentic selves to. And kind of carrying the weight for others. There's a sense of that where, I had to do that as a child. So my capacity for pain has progressed rapidly, and maybe more rapidly than others. And so there was almost a picking up of things that weren't necessarily my own because I had the capacity. And that's something that I still grapple with and use writing as an outlet for.
Thank you, Alex, for sharing that. That's a powerful answer and powerful forms of inspiration. There's just so much there, like, to be learned and unlearned and figured out. And I love that you are offering yourself to writing and using writing to kind of help yourself carry these things and maybe unload some of those weights, and expressing your experience and connecting with other people. Writing has the ability to do all of these things, and you recognize that and are doing it with intention and with it's like rising toward yourself, to go back to that initial conversation. Like, that's what's going on, and So I think it's only just to call it that.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, this kind of first part of my life was about that carrying of the weight and the pain. And I think now there's sort of a transformation happening where there's an understanding that in life, something that is so important for us to do is to increase our capacity to hold pain, because it's inevitable and it's a part of the human experience. However, I think that there's also a learning for myself and maybe for others of not having to carry so much, especially what is not mine. And there's a sort of transformation I'm entering into at this time in my life where I am learning that. And maybe with that will come almost this reclamation of my childhood. Not that, you know, I hate to say that it was stripped from me, because I don't want to use the tone of blame, because that isn't there. And there's no resentment or any harboring of those types of feelings, but there was an absence of certain parts of my childhood just due to my circumstances. And and so now, as I use that Ram Dass quote of "we're all walking each other home," I see myself as continuing to walk back home to myself and learning to put down so much of this pain that I believed I had to carry. And that leaves so much more room for this exuberance and this joy. And so, yeah, it does feel sort of like a reclamation of that childlike part of me.
I'd like to ask you to read another poem, if you don't mind. And that poem is Expression of Thee. And I chose this poem because it inspires me to want to write. I read this poem and I'm like, okay, I could do this. Like, I want to write too. And it's the style is so your style. And after reading a bunch of your poems, I'm like I could read this and say, okay, Alex wrote that. But there's something also that makes it that just feels so universal. And like, I don't know. I read it out loud, and I was like, damn, I want to write. And, you know, I do write, and I'm sure I did write a poem later on, just sort of inspired by that experience. So thinking about inspiration and experience, this is an inspiring poem. So thank you for this poem, and I'll ask you if you'd like to say anything about it before the reading.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that a lot of the times, like, my style, it shifts, but it also kind of stays the same. And it's this stream of consciousness. It's like, it's almost like, it's a stream of thought and a meditation in a sense. And this poem is the idea of just what it is to be human and how we go back and forth. And we're so complex. And a lot of the times, I think for myself, and maybe other people can relate to this, is there's this want to pinpoint. There's this need we have for certainty and consistency. And at the same time, we're very spontaneous. And we're very fleeting. We have a lot of cravings and desires and urges. And I think that this poem kind of plays on that. And it also talks about the things that go on within our minds. And so, yeah, I'll read it. And I think that for whoever's listening, we'll kind of get that idea. Expression of Thee, self, human in me. Look, when I was just a baby, I had no need to misconceive. Taint the perceiving of me a fluid spirit dwelling in a body that will grow. Come to know. Many a narrative put on a show, projection of my mind. It's really not hard to see what's inside. Humans mustn't need to hide, lie, keep the truth buried in. Sideways thinking, dry eyes start blinking, cheers to you, glasses clinking. Off in the corner thinking, just dance, prance, childlike exuberance. Suffocated by the quilts we weave of stories living in our heads. You guessed it, rent-free. Huffing and puffing, just breathe. Drop to your knees and pray for thee. Journey of life, this is me smiling in the pool as my blind mother allows me to be free. I look at her, knowing, yet not knowing, who she will be. Spirit transcending into flesh for a moment, a blink of an eye, and so why must we lie while the pot is bubbling and overflowing inside? Life's a wild ride, short and sweet, dark and deep. So be all you can be, and let the world see what lies beneath.
On the surface level, it's like so fun, and you have so many of these little rhymes that, because it's written in prose, you kind of have to figure out what's rhyming with what, right? Because sometimes thinking, clinking, thinking, like these are sort of different parts of the line, and dance, prance are right next to each other, and it's like, it's a really fun thing to just try, like to read a poem like this and to just taste it in your mouth, huffing and puffing and dark and deep and short and sweet, and the feeling of the poem in your mouth is a fun experience. There's like really a flow to it that it could be read 1,000 ways. You know, it's like I've just loved hearing you read it and hear where you breathe and where you stop and where the silences are and how the sentences work, because like you said, it's long sentences, and so all of those can kind of be understood different ways and broken down into fragments, or just being this long kind of soliloquy, but adjective form thing, whatever the adjective of soliloquy is. And so like it can be that way too, and then the title sort of leading into the poem just goes so well with everything else that's happening here. And I love a poem that does that, and I've written one poem that way, and damn, I was so proud of that thing. Like, it's just such a cool feeling to do that, because like I'm sure you've read other poems that do that, and like when I see yours doing it, I just like, hell yeah. And so thank you for that reading. And you guessed it, rent-free, there's like this playfulness happening.
Right. And this almost like, you know, using modern sayings, urban dictionary type style things. But yeah, I love how you pointed all of that out, because I could read that same poem and I could pause at different times and it would still flow. And that's what's so fun about it, is like, you know, there's this change that can happen in the reading of it.
Yeah. And like for, you know, someone who reads this poem without hearing you read it, it's a block on a page, right? It's like it's a full page of typed words, and that can be kind of like not intimidating, but we can kind of get lost in that, and without having line breaks and things like some poems have. And so I think you reading it just kind of gives it so much life, and like silences can be a big can play such a big role in the poem. And you stopped for quite a while after Rent Free and Huffing and Puffing, and then Just Breathe, like before Just Breathe, drop to your knees and pray for these, like that line, which is 2 lines or a line and a half, but it's like it stands out so much because of the way that you kind of broke it down.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned this word a few times, and I'd like to just kind of explore a little bit intention. And I say it's an important theme in your work, and I don't just mean the words that you're writing on the page, but just the, setting up of the custom poems. And, there's such an intention in that small table. Minimize the space, signage, papers. In the future, maybe there'll be Kleenex, but like that's your intention, right? And the poetry and tapas, right? Like all of these things are moments where you're sort of communicating with your desires and expectations. So can you just talk about that? Like intention, how do you move with intention? How does writing, reading poetry sort of interact with this idea of intention?
Yeah, I think intention is a huge part of my life. And even, the people that I surround myself with, I witness them also moving with intention. I think of the phrase, "You are who you keep." And I think there's such a balance to it. There's intention is very thoughtful. And, sometimes there can be too much of thought, and there needs to be more of just being. But it's this sense of mindfulness. I try with my life to be very intentional on a daily basis. What time am I waking up? What is the first thing I'm doing after I wake up? What am I consuming? One of the things that I did whenever I moved from my last place into my studio apartment, because it's 4 or 5 times smaller, was purge so many things. And that was extremely intentional. It became about this sort of minimalism of what do I need. And I intentionally didn't bring a TV into my space. I intentionally didn't bring a microwave. There's these little changes that I've noticed I've made. I bring grocery bags, big grocery bags every time I go to the grocery store. I go and fill up a 6-gallon water jug weekly with reverse osmosis water. So there's a sort of intention when it's coming to my health and the type of life that I want to live. And I've always been a very big planner. And there's a balance that has to happen in that as well. Because if you're a planner, you learn the hard way that life has its own way of unfolding, and you have to be adaptable to the magic and the mystery of life, and even the dismantling. And but at the same time, there's a sort of creation to the way that I'm living my life. I don't want to wait until I'm having health issues to start to get healthy. I want to be more preventative about it. I want to increase my quality of life now while I'm young and able. And so when it comes to my art and my writing, everything is very intentional. So when I'm setting up for the custom poetry, having the certain signage, having the simplicity of it, bringing the Kleenex, bringing a certain pen so I can sign my name because I like the way that the ink rolls on the paper. Everything I do is extremely intentional. The setting up of poetic therapy, the choosing the venue and each artist, was very intentional, down to when people were performing, the order that they were performing. Nothing is ever or rarely done just by random. So I live my life that way, and it's fun, and it's beautiful. And it's, when I'm not sitting around scrolling or watching TV, it's like you fill your days with something. And when I live with intention, it creates this fullness to my life. it really, I go to sleep sometimes, think all the time, really, wishing that I had more time, more hours in the day, because there is so much that I want to do and create. And I think there's a level of acceptance that I have to have in that, where I may never make everything that wants to come out of me in this lifetime, but I find that beautiful. I'd rather have more that I want to do than feel like I don't know what to do, or I've done everything. I'd rather kind of be overflowing. It's an overflowing of my cup, I guess you could say. So having said all of that, the books that I choose to read, the books that I choose to stop reading, and the art that I choose to make is all done with an intention. And those things change. Sometimes my intention is that I would like to make some more money, or sometimes my intention is that I just want to play. And so I try to check in with my inner world before going about my day and my life, to know which direction I'm heading in.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that, Alex. And one thing that stuck out to me when you said you're a planner, is I was thinking, like, planning is like planting, and it's like there's like that intention of, like, I'm going to sow this seed for my day and think about what can I do to make this, to scratch stuff off my to-do list. And like, then there's a guessing game in that too. Like when we have an intention, like, growing a garden or going do laundry, it's like there's a blend of like intention and attention and desire and like what we want and a plan and being proactive, and also just like chance and circumstance and timing and all these things. And I think that balance of knowing where we have control and where we don't is such an important piece in like managing our own expectations for ourselves. And that can be for anything, I guess, not just for creating, but also for rest, right? Like circumstance and intention that need to go together for us to be able to rest and do nothing. And then I just love that perspective. There's you reminded me too of so like in Jamaican English, a lot of people don't use the word diet, like to talk about eating a certain way. They say live it. It's like, oh, this is my live it. And it's like the coolest thing, I think, that the English language has to offer is like to say, I'm not going to say diet because I'm eating to live. So it's a live it. And there's such an intention in that, and just like totally dismissing the idea of eating a certain way to deprive ourselves of joy, but actually eating a certain way that contributes to our living and livelihood. And I think that sort of structure speaks to what you're talking about in the sense of being proactive, right? Like I'm not going to wait till I get sick to start eating vegetables. Like I'm just going to eat in a way that fulfills all parts of me right now. And
right. And I love what you just said about like live it, and like even that when you're intentional about your words, it reminded me of this book that I read called The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And it's a novel, based around slavery, the idea of slavery, but there's also a bit of fantasy magic in it. And he changes the words. So instead of them being called masters, they were called the quality. And instead of slaves being called slaves, they were called the tasked. And I loved that because it changed something. As I was reading it, it just altered a little perspective in my brain. And that was something that I left reading this wonderful novel with, was the way he just changed two of the words and why. It made me wish I could ask him, like, why? What was the intention behind that? But I almost don't need to, because I was able to form my own interpretation of that. And it really, I think that's the beauty of words, is being able to change something as simple as that, or as diet, to live it. It almost triggers something different. It's like it feels very chemical when it happens in the brain, and then it adjusts our behavior in some way, or our perspective.
Yes, totally. I fully agree with that chemical reaction. There's something sort of subconscious, or just like physically, that doesn't really have much to do with like the cerebral kind of floaty experience that we also often go through and go to. And yeah, it's like by uncalling a thing something, we realize what we've been doing to that thing by calling it that. And we like finally realize what's being signified with certain signifiers. And yeah, I'll have to check out that novel then.
I love the way you said that, especially when you think of being changed from masters to the quality. It does kind of recognize that there was there's almost like these people were of more quality. And when you use that word, it really makes you bring your index finger and your thumb to your chin. You go, it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it is so interesting. And I mean, even right now, what's happening in language, with trying to be more precise about things, because like I think you mentioned that in that story, the slaves were called the tasked, like ED. And so that is such an interesting switch that is like simultaneously more accurate, but also like underwhelming, because like right now, there's more and more, and I think rightly so, push to like use enslaved instead of slaves, like when talking about the like American slavery experience, because it like recognizes that it took, a crime of like a more powerful group to enslave these people. That's not all they are. They've just been like put in this situation, right? And tasked, like it sort of does the same thing. It's an adjective. And so there's just something so profound about little language changes, that speak to intention, right? It just reminds us that talking should have an intention. And, it's our mouths. We're just making noise, but there is a meaning with what we say, and we should, not should, I mean, I'm not the police, but it's just like, living with intention can also be applied to the way we speak. And I like the way that you put that, and I think that's such a powerful example.
Correct. And I think, that little word change too, it's not just little, it's very big, from speaking about the slavery experience in that way of the people who were enslaved rather than slaves, because I think using the word slaves, it's very, it gets very subconscious. Words can end up in the subconscious, and that is dehumanizing. And and then when you look at the word masters, that's like very narcissistic, very superhuman, and just taking that down a notch. I love how you called it underwhelming, because it is just the tasked. It almost gives way to these people who were deemed as the quality were very capable of being the tasked people. They just were not it. And it simplifies it in a way. And it kind of almost not dismisses race, but when you think of the word slaves, you picture a certain image in your mind versus when you think of the tasked. And I just think that that's so powerful.
Yeah, that is so powerful. And it kind of like it breaks it down and reduces it to the hierarchy, right? And like quality is being, it's not just like born out of nothing. It's sort of in relationship to an inferior thing. And so when you use the word quality to talk about a certain group of people, then it's like pointing to that hierarchy that exists, and master is doing that too. But I think that word has just been so weighted with like social experience and, you know, history class and I don't know, like pornography, like just the word master has so many different sort of contexts and baggage. And even the etymology comes from French and Latin, which the Latin is magister, which the root of that magist is Latin for more. So it's like master, when you boil it down to the, you know, the Latin sort of initial birth of it, just means more. And so that already that word has like hierarchy built into it. Yeah, language. It's crazy.
It is. It's a beautiful thing.
It's a lot going on. It's a beautiful thing, powerful thing.
It is.
So I have another request for you, and I would ask you to read the poem "Bring Me to My Knees." Is there anything you'd like to say about this poem?
This was the most recent poem out of the ones you've chosen that I've written. And, you know, this poem is born from these, you know, painful experiences I've had in intimate romantic relationships. And there's, you know, I'm noticing in all of my conversations, there's a balance, a harmony in life that I'm seeking. And there's a play at that with this as well, because when it comes to painful experiences in life, there's an acknowledging of the pain that is caused. There's there can be a separation in that of this person did this to me. And and I find that I like to not teeter so far. I'll allow myself to go from one end of the scale to the next, but I want to come back to the middle at the end. And so in this poem, I'm just kind of describing and acknowledging and validating my own pain, but also seeing the magic within that and the lessons and the beauty and the duality of life. And remembering in my moments of deep grief when I am on the floor, you know, aching in pain, that there is a certain beauty to being able to experience those emotions, and tying that all together with the recognition of love, of we're all one, and how gray is all of that. You know, it's it really does take the black and whiteness of life and that thinking that we can have just out, and it creates this very gray colored picture that it's all true. The pain is true. The love is true. The beauty and the lessons that we gain from that is true. And being able to hold all of that in my hands has been something I've been practicing. And, you know, there are certain moments that I have, certain people that I can run into that just crack me so wide open. And it taps on this part of my heart that just sends me into this like beautiful, painful spiral. And I think that's what this poem, that's the place that this poem was born from. So, bring me to my knees. Thank God, seeing you with him brings me to my knees because I need to pray. Thank God, all this noise and chaos has me staying in because I needed to care for myself. Thank God that I'm learning loss is really just loving from afar. Thank God all of this is so easy because it's so hard. The train roars off in the distance and reminds me of our soft rage right before I get in the car, headed to wherever I'm going. Thank God your truth sucker punched me in the gut because I needed to run to the mirror to remind myself I am lovable. I needed to sit in the rut and dig up all of the mud so I can find where the worms live and offer up my seeds. Thank God you loved me because that's all I'll ever need. Thank God the grass is growing so I can see how time passes. Things change, and what's been the same won't last. And thank God for love. It never dies. And we may try to lie in its face, under the cloak of a warm embrace, but no matter how far we stray, we will always feel the tug to home. Thank God for art, for poetry, because it gives this life meaning, and it keeps my bones aching with the tenderness of my being. Thank God for expression, because all this would be too heavy a weight to carry. Thank God for heartbreak, because I need to be cracked so wide open that the gates of heaven come flooding out of my chest. Thank God for the pain, because I need to know which wound needs tending to. Thank God for my garden, because I need to be brought to my knees, to bow down in honor of it all, and to remember how very big and how very small it all really is. Thank God all of this brings me to my knees, because I need to pray.
Thank you, Alex. That was Bring Me to My Knees, and I'm like applauding right now. Love that. Love that poem. Thank God for love. I love that repetition of thank God, and I like the different sort of forms that the verb bring me take. Like bring me to my knees is like an order. It's like looking forward. It's like a demand or a request, right? Like do this to me. And not just to the reader, but to the garden and to life and to your future self, right? It's like an ask of life to bring me to my knees. And then, this thing brings me to my knees. So that's like a habitual kind of present, but ongoing kind of present. And then later on, thank God for my garden because I need to be brought to my knees. So there is like subjunctive. It's like I need this to happen in the future. All of this brings me to my knees, and I just love that, and I love sort of the spell of it. Like this poem is like a simultaneous kind of prayer and spell, and it's proof that poetry is a spell and a prayer.
Yes. Thank you for that. And yeah, I think, that line of, thank God seeing you with him brings me to my knees because I need to pray. It's almost, it's an uncontrollable, those moments in life when we are brought to our knees. I love that image. And I love that, that line because it's very real, and it's very, I think it's in parallel to deep pain and tragedy and very collective. And so that part is like, there's no control. I'm here. And so what can I do from here, this point where I am at my knees? Well, pray. And then when you move to the garden, it's a little bit different, I think that speaks about like, I talk about that here of like the train, and I'm just driving, I'm going somewhere, I'm living my life. And, nothing tremendous is happening. And that's a place where we can almost harden. It's not to say like, oh, we need to always be cracked open. But one of my favorite quotes is by Rumi. And it's, you have to keep breaking your heart until it opens. And I love that because I think we can go about our daily life and and not even recognize that hardening that happens. But having this garden and having to be brought to my knees, that line kind of talks about almost a self-softening in a sense, almost a way of breaking my own heart, like tapping on the tender parts of myself and finding that softness within where I may have put up some sort of wall.
That's right. Yeah, and allowing it to happen, right? Allowing that grief in and allowing that, all these painful emotions in to break us, because we know that it's necessary to become, and we know that we have to be affected by it in order to get beyond it. And I just love that opening line. I think it's so powerful and visceral and like such a strong image and such a good and like efficient way to kind of address grief and loss and in the relationship sense. And I think it's like in coming out of I'm totally just like applying my own experience to the contextualization of this line, like grief in sort of the relationship sense of like losing someone and seeing them move on to someone else. That is a simultaneously like past oriented experience, pain, and also like a future oriented pain, because when we lose someone, we lose all the memories that we were going to make with that person. And so it's like you see somebody making memories with someone else, then we have nothing else to do but like feel that emotion. And so, and in comes the vulnerability and openness and putting that wall down. Then it's like, here's the bodily kind of effect. And I'm just brought to my knees in this vulnerable position, and, noise and chaos and all these things happen. And then later on you have the gates of heaven come flooding out of my chest. Thank God for the pain, right? I'm so happy I went through that, and I'm so happy that I'm allowing myself to go through that, because now the future-oriented part, a garden, it's like when you are tending to a garden, that is like one of the most future-oriented and hope-filled experiences that a person can have. It's like I am planting for the future, and that also brings me to my knees. But this time, or maybe not but this time, I guess I could say, and also this time in honor of it. So not just in honor of the trauma or in honor of the loss, but in honor of like the fulfillment that is to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that part about heaven coming flooding out, it reminds me of a friend one time told me, as I was going through a breakup, allow your heart to swell before it hardens. And I never forgot that. I loved that. Because it gave image to slowing down. Those parts of life are painful and sometimes, excruciating. But, suppressing it and trying to move past it more quickly than we should reminds me of that line. And I don't know if you've ever seen or read the book Call Me By Your Name. Highly recommend it. I love it. It's so well written, and the movie is absolutely stunning. But there's a line at the end where he talks about we rip so much out of ourselves to be cured of things faster that by the time we turn 30, we have less and less to offer someone else. And I just, I think I love that sentiment and that idea of just slowing down. And I often see in this culture, people going from one relationship to the next. And, I've done that very, very little time, maybe one time, because I just am the type of person that I need that time to almost tend to my inner garden, I would say.
Yeah.
It's like the storm just came and it just ripped shit apart, and I've got to tend to it. It's going to take some time to tend to this.
Yeah.
And in that, there's so much beauty and the heaven, that's what that represents. Is we run from that pain, but there is a sort of pleasure in that pain. If we allow ourselves to sit long enough, we will discover that.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And that pain, it can hurt and it can come in waves, right? It's so not linear, and it's so it's like unspeakable sometimes. But at the same time, you're right. When we sit in it, and it's something, I think, that needs to be sat in and needs to be kind of swam in for a while before we can see, this is so human, and it's so necessary for me to realize who I have been, and kind of deconstruct or boil down almost like who I am to get to that next version of me that I'll love even more, and that I need to meet.
Right. That's a part of the creative process, is that sort of that destruction, the idea of the mandala, that is, you spend so many hours creating this beautiful, delicate piece of art, and with one brush of a palm, it's completely gone. But it creates a blank canvas for something new to be formed.
And on that note, I'd like to just sort of close out with a conversation about pleasure. When we talk about all these things that we're talking about, so healing, care work, and we didn't get into this much, but I think sometimes in conversations around queer narratives and then community trauma, and there's so many sort of negative and difficult struggles that can come into conversation. We just mentioned like grief and loss, and these are so necessary, and they come through in our work, and it can be so powerful. And it's equally necessary, and you do this in your poetry, to recognize trauma, name the trauma, and also recognize pleasures and little pleasures, big, immense ones, all of these joyful experiences. And so I'd like if you would do me the pleasure for you to read Mornings, and to just kind of discuss it, if you'd like to discuss it as well.
Absolutely. I think I'll read it and then we can talk about it. Okay.
That's great.
Mornings. I can't get enough of them. The joy of waking manifests in the birds, the plants, freshly showered from the night's dew. The sun slowly rising 1 inch at a time, caressing everything it touches. Sometimes jazz on the radio, and 3 beeps, the coffee pot alerts when it's ready. The rich aroma wafting through the house, notes of caramel, cherry, and nuts. The sunflowers standing tall and proud, and the rest of the garden waiting its turn to bathe in the light of the day. And if I've done yard work the day before, well, then the mornings are extra crisp. I sip on a cocktail of pride in caretaking and of the abundance that nature keeps giving. Quiet as a mouse in the mornings so that I can hear everything clearly. And so I don't startle the mind with fast-paced wheels that run for the rat race that has already begun. Imagine waking up thinking of all the money to be made whilst overlooking the blessings right in front of our faces.
Thank you for that, Alex. Mornings. Are you a morning person?
Yes. Can you tell?
I couldn't tell. I just had to ask to make sure.
Yes. I mean, sometimes I work nights, so it makes early mornings hard. But my favorite is like a 5:36 a.m. before the sun has risen.
I used to work as a butcher for 6 years. I was a butcher in Opelousas at Kelly's Country Meat Block and Diner. And I had to start cooking cracklings at 5 in the morning because we opened at 7 and people would come in at 7, and be looking for freshly cooked cracklings. So I would like start cooking them at 5. So I had to be there at 5, and I was like, at least I lived in Opelousas, but I was living in Lafayette for a while, so I'd drive from Lafayette. I was also living in Sunset for a while. So anyway, I say all that to say, when I would get there, the sun, for most of the year wasn't up yet, or it was just kind of first light. And I really fell in love with mornings in that experience. Just the advantage. I don't know, there's some kind of superiority. Like I see why like morning people are basically running the world, because there's this sort of go-getterness and that comes with being up in the morning. Like, I'm up, got this going, coffee, got some work done, went running, people who run in the morning, and like you mentioned that, right? It's like the mind, fast-paced wheels that run for the rat race. That there's like I guess a productivity and like almost capitalistic side of being a morning person. But this is like recognition of the morning as a time for self and for mindfulness and jazz and pleasure, right? Caressing everything. I just love that.
Yeah, I think the morning offers like a certain magic and honestly the most pleasure. But what's interesting about that, people might think, no, nighttime, because there's dancing, there's sex, there's alcohol, there's drugs, whatever. But I would oppose that, because I think that there's a certain high that the morning offers that's a very clear, sober type of feeling, and you have all your pleasures, you have your slowness that even the nighttime doesn't offer. It's that 3, 4, 5 a.m. experience where people are still asleep, animals are still asleep, everything is very at ease, and there's this calm that's kind of caressing the earth, if you will. And and there's this like I talked about the dew, and there's that almost like cleansing, like there's a moisture, but soon there will be this like other form of bathing in the sun, and your coffee. Everyone, coffee is such a pleasure for so many people. And I could talk about mornings for forever. And I love that you had that experience with having to be up so early, and I'm sure there was some sort of pleasure in that too, like getting the cracklings ready for those morning people. And there's a sort of like joy that I can imagine the type of customer that was going into the butcher shop, and that sort of like joy and exuberance that happens in the morning. You have the whole day. There's this feeling of like the whole day is ahead of me.
And then starting the day too with like providing that service. And I mean, our cracklings are good over there. It's not me bragging. It's just like they were good. And so people would come and, I imagine someone who wakes up early enough to get dressed and get ready to go to this place to buy meat, maybe for the weekend or for, some family get together that night or whatever. And they're at this, a little grocery store, meat market at 7 a.m. when a lot of people are still asleep, and they're eating, fried pork skins, and like they're living their own version of a pleasure morning, right? Of like they did all the things they needed to do to be out and about and eating food and buying, and they're doing their own act of service. They're shopping for groceries to prepare food for their family or loved ones later on. And there's something so universal and collaborative about the morning pleasure. And you mentioned the joy of waking manifests in the birds. I love that line so much. And I take so much joy in birds. Like, I feel such a strong connection to those animals. And then, like, as a child, but in my family, my nickname is perroquet, which means parrot in French. And so I've always identified with like polyglot birds, mockingbirds and crows and ravens and parrots and these birds who talk. And I think about birds talking in the morning, but you have like it manifests with in the birds. So like another thing I thought about too in my own experiences. So when I would go to work, sometimes I'd go visit my grandparents before I'd go into work because I knew my grandfather would be up. And so like one morning I went there, it was like 4:30 and he was already awake and he was drinking coffee and watching TV and maybe or reading or something. And I walked in and he's like, "Tu dormais avec les poules?" Which means, "Were you sleeping with the chickens?" Which is so funny because it's like, why else would you be awake right now unless you were sleeping with, in the same structure or same, room as these birds who, those are the only things that wake up this early. And I just love that analogy and that connection with, it's like a multi-species kind of experience that you only get if you're up that early.
Yes, exactly. I love that you mentioned your grandparents because that was another thing I was going to say about my morning experience. They created this love and this connection I have to coffee and to mornings. And I loved spending the night with my grandparents, and I could hear them. I wasn't always up at the same time as them. It was very rare because I was young. I was in high school. I was getting up in the summers at like 11 o'clock. But they would be up at 4 a.m. and they would have this like soft Cajun French radio playing, and you could smell the coffee throughout the house, and this kind of like soft like whisper of talking that was very soothing. And oftentimes they were making something that they called lung debuffs. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's very similar to a beignet. I think the difference, I'm not really sure what the difference is. I think they would just take biscuits, stretch it apart, fry it in a pan, and then dust powder, like powdered sugar over it, and you'd eat it with syrup. Oh, wow. And it was shaped differently than a beignet, and it wasn't like the little pocket. It was very similar to a funnel cake, but not in that kind of geometrical shape. And they called them lung debuffs. I don't know why, but those are.
So what is the shape? Can you describe the shape?
It's if you imagine like taking a raw biscuit and like pulling it apart and stretching it, it'll create these little holes. And so when you're frying it in a pan, it almost sometimes would be like an oval shape, and it would have like a kind of almost like the edges would form like a crust looking, and then there would be little holes in the middle of it from where you pulled the biscuit apart. But it would stay, you would keep it as one. You wouldn't completely break it. And it was...
So it's kind of long and oval.
Yeah, and they were delicious. And those experiences they were very like core memories for me.
Yeah, there's so much pleasure in that. And those childhood and adolescent experiences, the grandparents, the coffee. I mean, shout out to grandparents getting, I think most of us hooked on coffee. I know... For me, I was like 3 years old drinking, community dark roast with milk and sugar. And, just drinking black coffee and not community dark roast these days. But, that's great. And it's like, it's so rich, right? And I think this poem alludes to that, or this poem describes that. And what you're describing is just the richness of those memories and how they kind of, we can rely on mornings to recreate that pleasure. And it's like a time where we can do that now for ourselves. We can have the music that we enjoy playing, and we can drink coffee and smell coffee.
Yeah, so absolutely. And, it's, I love how you said we can recreate that for ourselves, because it's almost like a timelessness with those memories. And if I am up at those hours, they're there isn't a morning at that time that will go by that I won't think of my grandparents. And I think, there's also, we're kind of touching on like Southern mornings, that experience you had with the coffee milk. That's a very much, I would say, like a Cajun Southern thing. So yeah, there's a lot of pleasure to be found in the mornings.
Yes. Yeah, no doubt. And like just the localization.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and a lot of writers, when I look up, I'm very interested in like Toni Morrison and Elizabeth Gilbert and what is there or was their writing routine. It was always in the mornings. And so,
do you write in the morning?
I do sometimes. That is my preferred time, but I will write anytime I'm inspired. But if I am up and at 'em in the mornings and I have my coffee, I am at my desk writing.
Yeah, Toni Morrison, she wrote early. I don't know if I could write that early. She'd be up at 5?
Yeah, right? Maybe even earlier.
Maybe even earlier. So I was cooking cracklings and she was writing maybe the novel Home. I think that's her most recent one.
Yeah, that's pretty early to already have yourself set up and ready to go.
Right, I agree. Oh yeah, and thinking in that spirit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. Thank you for talking about mornings with me, and thank you for everything you provided. I mean, I know that's a long conversation we just had, and I'm so thankful for it. I'm thankful for your time and all the rich moments that you shared with me and your experience. What a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chase. This was very inspiring, and I appreciate your feedback on all of my poetry and just deep diving into all of these questions with me, and also sharing the appreciation for poetry and art. So thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.